First of all, thank you for coming. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and be among friends and family and colleagues on a day like this. So that's my first comment. I wrote this thesis. I started writing it, I guess, 4.5 years ago. I applied for a scholarship called New Learning Processes in Voluntary Social Organizations, which I thought, my interest at that time in exchange and learning, and that I thought that might fit. So that's how I entered this project. The project was also connected to the Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship was completely new to me at that time. So that has been a journey as well to get to know this field and explore what entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship is, and connect my anthropological background and educational background to this field of social entrepreneurship. So the project intends to unfold educational anthropology in a voluntary organization, because voluntary organizations are seen as part of what we can call social entrepreneurial activities in the third sector, outside of market, outside of private or public sector. It has its own logic and its own agenda, and we have people there in voluntary sectors that do meet the ambitions of creating social solutions as an alternative to the solutions already provided by, for instance, the public sector. So that's why voluntary sector in terms of social entrepreneurship became quite interesting to me. And then the whole theoretical framing of it was, as I said, educational and anthropological. Structuring a presentation like this is quite hard based on 4 or 5 years' work, as some of you know and others probably understand. So I wanted to tell you about the structure of the thesis a little bit, just to let you know what it is that I've been trying to bring forward here and try to boil down to you guys. So the structure of the thesis, well, this list doesn't say much, but in the introduction, I sort of frame educational anthropology. I argue why I use economic anthropology and how economic anthropology is linked to educational anthropology. I also tell about learning and educational research, and I try to frame how I want to sort of apply this knowledge to social entrepreneurial field. After that, I introduce the empirical field, which is going through City of London as a charity. How is it legally and publicly and practically situated in London, in the world? Who are my informants? Who were they? How many have I interviewed? Stuff like that. My data material. Then I go into a theoretical aspect of my thesis, where I fuse the different theoretical backgrounds. So the educational and the anthropological. I spent quite a lot of space on doing that, introducing Marcel Mauss, trying to bring him up to present time, and then frame it with educational theory. In the methodology section, which is quite large because of the ethnographic approach and because of my anthropological background, methodology is seen quite important. That's where I account for who am I to say something about this field. What is my background? What is my motivation for doing this? And what could be the bias of my background? And studying an educational field as an educator myself has some aspects that is needed to be unfolded. So that's what I do in the methodology section. I also tell about the multi-sided ethnography which I've applied. It's a particular type of ethnography that argues that following, in my case, the volunteers around various fields instead of just, or various sites in the field instead of just being at one site, brings out other perspectives than if I'd only stayed at City Year London's head office in London. Because what I did was I followed them to schools, I followed them to community activities, to their unity rallies, which is where they're sort of, and you'll get to know this later a bit, they're lined up in public spaces and saying things and yelling and singing and stuff like that. So they're quite a remarkable bunch of volunteers, and we're not used to that sort of volunteering in Denmark. So anyway, they are very busy and they're all over London. And I started out with meeting 62 volunteers and had to figure out which ones of them I was to follow and how to do this. And so I account for that in my methodology section. In my pre-study, so I divided the analysis into two parts, the pre-study and the main study. And that was inspired by a guy called Richard Swedberg, who says that when you're in a field that where you can't really apply existing theory without doing damage to your empirical data, you might benefit from theorizing, developing your own theory on your own. I thought that was quite inspiring, particularly because I was fusing so many approaches. So I thought, and I found myself trying to argue this approach, this approach, this approach. And I thought, this is not doing any good to my empirical data. Maybe I should take something of what Richard Swedberg has said about theorizing to heart and then experiment a little bit with that. So that's what I did. In the pre-study works is a phase where analytically you're very open, you remain creative and open to the field and try to develop your own models, try to figure out how does this work. Of course, this was not just data-driven, it was indeed also theoretically informed by economic anthropology. So the pre-study ends out with sort of a model. It explores the field and it ends out with a model that I use in the main study to build on, to make my analytical points through. The main study is occupied with, firstly, the uniform as an object, exchanging the uniform in the organization between the organization and the volunteer, between the volunteer and the public who sees the volunteers in their uniforms. So, and secondly, the main study is also occupied with stories, narratives, myths, which is a great part of City of London. In this presentation, I won't be able to go deeply into the narratives and the stories in City Year that are circulating because of the time frame. So I chose to elaborate on the uniform, which I hope you'll enjoy. And then I end up with the conclusions. And so, as you might sense, it is an elaborate work. Try to sort of be boiled down to less than 45 minutes by now. So it's 40 minutes left. So that's why the structure of my presentation is I'm going to introduce to you my objective, a bit more about my methodology. I'm going to introduce you to the theory that I used. And I'm going to show you the empirical field. I have a brief video that I'm going to show you. Then I'm going to go into analytical examples, and I thought it might be interesting to both see examples from the pre-study where the process was more creative and open and explorative, and the main study, which is then a bit more narrowed down and more nuanced. And then I'm going to end up with a sum up. So yeah. So the objective, as Roger's already read to you, was that I wanted to find out how the volunteers' learning processes were connected to the exchanges of social value in City of London, and what exchanges characterized the youth-driven organization. So young peer learning, youth peer learning has been a topic of interest of mine for many years. So that was my approach to City of London as well. In trying to figure this out, I asked myself these two sub-questions as well, about pre-existing organizational values, pre-existing individual values, the values that are brought together in this field that were already existing prior to the meeting. How did that influence these processes? And how does it relate to skills acquisition? And that's the learning part, if you want. And then personal development also in the learning area. Yeah. I already told you a little bit about how I did that. In this type of work, like you already know a little bit about, there are many things to be considered. This was my primary focus, the analytical field. The analytical field is something that you create as an ethnographer. It's where you set the frame for how this is to be done and what is to be done. So I wanted to theorize educational anthropology, as I said. I wanted to contribute to understanding learning as social exchange. And I chose City of London for that. The empirical field has had a crucial influence on the study. And after interviewing, observing, recording, listening through, and through what I've recorded, transcribing the interviews and all that, there's been a extended period of coding as well. Coding is when you read everything you have through, and then you sort of generate analytical themes from the data material. Because of the large data material, this has been a quite extensive work to do. So it's a good thing that you have at least 3 years to do this. Then, like I said, anthropology and ethnography are used as a method, and then economic anthropology particularly are used as the analysis method. The method was also inspired by economic anthropology, by observing exchanges. So it's not only used analytically, it's also used methodologically. And then conceptualizing learning. I first have a general discussion about learning as a concept. I have a critical discussion about learning as a concept, particularly also in social entrepreneurship, where I criticize how learning legitimizes fund seeking. So if you call yourself learning as an organization of some sort, if you can sort of argue that you're a learning organization, it gives you access to apply for certain funds that you wouldn't otherwise have had access to. So I have a critical discussion about how learning has become a multifaceted concept and is used in particular ways or in various ways. And I want to get more into a more close understanding on learning as a theoretical concept, which is why I go back to the cognitivist Jean Piaget, who has written about assimilation and accommodation, a process that he calls adaptation. I also have found inspiration in social learning theory, particularly Levin-Wenger's situated learning, and where they talk about mentoring as well. So, but still I argue that where social learning, this social learning theory sort of ends, is where economic anthropology has a potential of elaborating further, from stating that we move from a peripheral participant into central participant, is contributive, but I want to get further into what then is going on when we observe learning, what is exchanged between two people, between a person and the organization. So it wasn't quite enough, which is why I added Piaget. Yeah, so I want to introduce you to economic anthropology, which is also a bit ungrateful to do in a very short time. But in 1924, the French ethnographer and social activist Marcel Mauss wrote an essay he called The Gift. It was based on not his own field works, but on ethnographical findings earlier on in the Trobriands and among Indians in North America and Polynesia. And so he wrote this essay about the gift, and he had more points which were quite interesting. First of all, he said there are no free gifts. Gifts aren't free. If we give something, the one we give to is obliged to give something back. This is very briefly delivered to you guys. He also said exchange consists of three actions: giving, receiving, and reciprocating, which is basically what I just said. There's an action of giving, there's an action, and then there's someone receiving it, and then there's this obligation to reciprocate. It can be reciprocated to the person that has just given to you, or it can be reciprocated to someone else. Depends on what sort of relation you're in, or what sort of community you're in. So what was also groundbreaking was that instead of understanding economy as a means-end relationship, economy, when Mauss was elaborated after he published this essay, other people started thinking about this, and Carl Polanyi in 1968 presented this idea about economic principles, which was based on or inspired by Mauss. He said they're not just one economy. The market economy is not the only economic principle. There are three economic principles. The market economy is one of them. Then there's redistribution, and there's reciprocity. He called this the substantive idea of economy. And this quotation I find quite central to this understanding of economy. Economy as deriving from man's dependence for his livelihood upon nature and his fellows. It refers to the interaction with his natural and social environment insofar as it results in supplying him with the means of material want satisfaction. So here we have a completely different understanding of economy than only the market understanding. So, because of this, the focus on, what is it? The livelihood upon nature and its fellows. Because it's focused on the exchanges between people, understanding economy as exchanges between people that are near you. And on the micro-sociological perspective on giving, receiving, and reciprocating in a community, this theoretical approach is particularly sensible to social dynamics and processes, in my interpretation, which is why I wanted to apply it to learning. Learning has also been theorized and analyzed as exchanges between the learner and the educator, and social learning by Lev as well, about how people are interacting. So that's why I found it quite sensible to merge the two. Marcel Mauss is old and he's passed. So we were talking about how to apply this in contemporary situations and contemporary communities. And for that, I was greatly helped by an anthropologist from London School of Economics, David Graeber. David Graeber must have had the same vision as me, only he was able to take it much further than I have been. He wrote a book called Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value. So within current economic anthropology, this is a great book to read if interested. In this book, David Graeber is occupied with the spirit of the gift. The thing is, Mauss, like I showed you before, talks about giving, receiving, and reciprocating, and says that reciprocating, or the obligation to reciprocate, comes from the fact that the gift has a spirit. So when I give something, it carries something of me with it. And in the end, it wants to return to me, which is why it sort of gets its own life when it's offhanded. So David Graeber, actually, he sets out in this work, he sets out to sort of explore this. He asks, does the gift have a spirit? And this is very nerdy theoretical writings about interactions, basically, and human economy. Or, social economy. So, he does this by exploring individual expression through exchange. So exploring how the individual expresses him or herself by giving, and by what he or she is giving. So he goes into the individual motivations and actions around giving. In that process, he comes across individual reflection in the object or in the value which is passed on, and how the individual creates the process of creation, and how creation and reflection is connected. This is another point which I will carry on into talking about learning. He argues that this perspective is a dynamic structuralist. Mauss was very much inspired by a structuralist tradition, and Graeber argues that it's dynamic structuralism because we still want to find patterns in exchanges but it's to be dynamically understood. And he ends up by arguing that what Morse is talking about when he talks about reciprocity and how we feel obliged to give back once we've received something from each other is because we live in an everyday communism, as he says, or an individual communism. So this becomes sort of the focus of his idea of reciprocity. This is particularly relevant when we talk about reciprocity, individual communism or everyday communism. And like I wrote, it's the idea that everybody's counting on it, but no one is counting. So we give and receive, but we don't keep score. Yes. So how do I move from economic anthropology and to theorizing learning as social exchange? I point to the fact that individual meaning, creation of meaning, creating something meaningful and valuable to the individual, and social inspiration or social innovation are deeply connected and are mutually dependent. I also, inspired by Graeber, argue that the individual's past and future actions are significant. So what I've done and what I'm going to do are two different things and carries two different types of value, which also interact. The past actions are something that which we are prone to reflect on. Future actions have more to do with desire or intention. So two notions become central here. Action, that one's visible persona, one's being, is simply the cumulative effects of actions that have been directed towards one in the past. So it's not only what have I done in the past, it's also what has been done to me, what has been given to me. And also time becomes crucial, because reflection is really only that between actions to be carried out in the future and ones already carried out in the past. So when I talk about reflection here, I want you to sort of link it to learning and, yeah, experience. So yeah. And last theoretical slide here. Is that when I theorize on learning as social exchange, I also conclude that all change and learning is based on an active movement or exchange between 2 points. That's what I sort of found when I explored all these theories and also my data material. Inner and outer, which Graeber talks about, that I link to reflection. He also uses the metaphor of the mirror. When we observe ourselves in mirror, what happens, what goes on in our heads. And then Piaget's assimilation and accommodation, how I appropriate myself to my surroundings and how I appropriate my surroundings to myself. And that process, trying to find an equilibrium, a balance between the two, and the process he calls adaptation. And then pointing to entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, also conclude that creation and destruction is also part of this process. So theorizing on all of this, I focused on activities. I focused on the activities that I observed on oral communication, on visual representations, because it says something about what people regarded as valuable and what they took to heart or what they wanted to pass on, and then the social mirroring. And after I collected all the data, those were my coding themes. just the 5 first: personal motivation. And these things are arose empirically, which is to say this is something that came out of my data and which was not defined by me. The volunteers talked a lot about personal motivation, learning, negotiations with the organization, interaction at schools, and friends at City of London, the team. And then you can see the rest. All right, those of you who aren't asleep, now I'm gonna let you off the theoretical stuff here and introduce you to City of London. City Year is an American charity which has, I think it's 23 maybe, affiliates all over the world. Most of them are placed in the United States of America. There's one in South Africa, Johannesburg, and then there's City of London. I'm sorry about the bad solution here of the picture. And then there's a new one in Birmingham. But yeah, so I was in London. City of London is the first city year in Europe. And I'm gonna wake you up with a video and introduce you to the organization. Remember, this is for commercial use mainly, and my focus was on the volunteers. Yeah, you'll probably see this as a sales pitch on City Year's behalf, but I thought it was the best way to introduce you to who these people are.
Teamwork is a fundamental part of City Year's culture. Like many professional organisations, we meet at the beginning of the day to discuss the priorities and agenda for that day. Also, it's a time for us to discuss our successes as a team and in City Year as a whole, and what we're doing in school. We call these joints.
Every morning at Sea Bright, we do a breakfast club. It's run from about 8 till 9:15. With this breakfast club, we get lots of different children that don't get to eat at home. They get to eat, they get to come in early so they're ready for their lessons and get some organisation from their day-to-day life. So they're all here, settled in, make sure they've eaten, they're relaxed and ready for the day ahead so they can perform their best.
We do PT every morning at Whitmore. It really helps to energise the kids. It gets them fired up in the mornings. It really helps to get them ready to face the challenges of the day. And since we've been doing PT, we've noticed a change. The kids have been coming early to school. They always have a smile on their face and they really just love doing PT in the mornings.
And this goes to the beat, we've got to turn around, shake your body, jump, jump, 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 shake your body, jump.
Good morning, people.
Good morning, Alice.
How are you feeling?
Fire.
I said, how are you feeling?
Fire.
Whitmore, are you ready to perform? Bananas, excellent.
Whitmore's always ready.
Ready, musicians?
Ready.
Begin.
Here, bananas, hill, bananas that we chop. Bananas, chop, chop. Bananas that we mash. Bananas, mash, mash. Bananas that we eat. Bananas, eat, eat. Bananas that we turn. Bananas, turn, turn. Bananas, bananas.
Step out, Whitmore.
During classroom support, I work with Year 7, who are aged 11 and 12 years old. As core members, we are an extra resource here complementing the the work done by the LSAs and the teachers, and together we have the aim to help these students raise their attainment.
And they get to kind of see how to act in the playground, what's acceptable, because we can model the correct behaviour for them. And it's a chance for us to kind of be more friendly with them, because in the classroom you have to do the code switch, so in the classroom you're very disciplinarian, but then outside you can be silly and have fun, so you build a better relationship with the pupils that way.
One-to-one learning. This is the time of day when we take a child who's really struggling in class and bring them out to somewhere here like the library. We use this time to really give them the extra care and attention they need. By going at their pace, we really help concepts hit home and really register with them. This helps their overall attainment.
That's so special about City is the fact that we're seen to be big brothers and big sisters to many of the students, because unfortunately many of the students do not have that positive role model around them. One thing that we do is to eat lunch with the students, because it helps to reinforce good values and good attitudes. 3 of those things that are so important to us are working hard, having good aspirations, and generally being good citizens.
At the end of the school day, CTA continue helping children through the different after-school programs they offer. They plan and lead on clubs such as arts and crafts, athletics, film club, homework and reading. These allow the children to broaden their horizons and also offer them fun, free activities.
So I'm going to stop here because of the time frame. All right, so you got an idea of what this organization is. Full-time volunteers for 1 year in London schools, between 18 and 25 years of age. I observed the core of 2011 to 12. Yeah, that's my informants. In my pre-study, I explored how there were various types of exchange modes, if you might. And I divided it into these 3 types of exchange. There was a business organizational type of exchange where the volunteers were sort of at work. There was a symbolic organizational type of exchange where the volunteers were sort of together around a meaningful cause. It was quite emotional sometimes. There were organizational myths and connected to this type of behavior. The uniform was sort of seen as part of this sphere where the volunteers were expressed as heroes or as making a change in the world and stuff like that. Also drawing on rituals where they had to sort of apply themselves to the organizational logic. And behind these 2 types of exchange, I observed that there were spontaneous selves. They were quite humoristic, and there were sort of people behind the uniform also. And that was quite interesting to me because it says something about the everyday communism and the reciprocity, that there was sort of a life behind the uniform. So that was quite an important finding. I'm going to rush you through the pre-study. This is sort of, you don't have to read that. This is sort of how I figured out, or I observed code switching at first. So it came out of my observations and not vice versa. I also observed, this one is where where I observe how people are checking their phone and they're coming in late, and how there's a normal life behind all these visions. This is another example where I observed in an interview, I asked this person what he felt Cydia had given him, and he said discipline. Did you read the back of their shirt? It said power, discipline, purpose, pride, right? So I asked him about this, and he said discipline. It gave him discipline, it gave him pride, and it gave him purpose, and he was talking. And I said, but you're listing your T-shirt. So that's when sort of I tried to get underneath the representation of the organization and try to get into who are these people we're not representing, and just so, which led us to laugh. And so humor is seen as something which opens up this sort of exchange. I also observed how another volunteer said that he had a problem bottling up stuff. And I asked about it, and he showed me how it was something that, it came up because he had participated in an activity in City of London. It was a ritual. And I asked him about how it was for him to participate in that ritual, and he said, but I also have a problem bottling up things. And I said, why do you think that? And he said, well, some of my friends said that at some point. And it turned out that his personal emotional theme was sort of circulating through him, of course, between his private sphere and City of London, which was also quite an interesting finding. So I ended up with this model as a sort of a draft for understanding in my main study what was going on in City of London. So that was all sort of the end result of my pre-study. I then wanted to apply that in my main study, which is part of the theorizing task. So what was interesting to look at in City of London was how the volunteers were placed between, with the kids also, they were placed between friends and teachers, and how they were sort of in between. And the uniform was or is an iconic object in City of London, by which the volunteers are recognized, and they also use it in legitimizing behavior, and both towards themselves but also towards their surroundings. So in this I observed how firstly the volunteers were connected to the uniform, and then how they detached from it later on. So that's what I'm going to walk you through here. They mainly connected to the uniform through this ceremony called the Red Jacket Ceremony. It's the first time they are handed the jacket. It's at the end of the introductory period of 3 weeks. So, and there's a particular way that the volunteers sort of merge with the uniform and the organizational values, because the uniform represents the organizational values. So this is an example of how a volunteer dedicates the jacket. When they receive it, they dedicate the jacket. And he says, my name is, and I anonymize that, and I proudly serve on the team A. I would like to dedicate the jacket to a math teacher of mine who, as you know, I wasn't the best child in school, but she never gave up on me. I had her all through school, she never gave up on me. And it didn't matter how bad I was or what I did, she just never ever gave up. She knew I could get the GCSEs, which I did. I later found out that a year later, that all through that she was suffering with cancer, and unfortunately she died over the summer. And I just want to dedicate this to her, because this is what I want to remember, that no matter how hard things get, I've always got to be there for them, the mentee kids. So this is going on at a ritual where this team is standing in line and they're handed their jacket one by one, and they dedicate the jacket in turn. And this example shows how gratitude towards a former teacher in the past creates a sense of responsibility to pay this, what she's done for him, forward. And this sense of responsibility is increased by the fact that she's no longer here among us. So he attaches a vow to the jacket, and the jacket becomes a symbol of the opportunity to give back. And the action which he has observed at the teacher, because he has observed it, it's able to be repeated. He's able to repeat the action that he's observed done to him. So there's something that he passes on that goes from the teacher through the volunteer and to the children mentees, which is sort of a favor, being there for them, helping them. So this is an example of the reciprocation and how it circulates. Something that also happens here is that a deed, once it's done, it becomes valuable to the person who's done it. So the jacket also represents an opportunity to have a value of the past later on. So once I've carried out the help towards these children, I can point to it later on and say, this is something I did. So it becomes a potential value to the volunteers. And also what was important to the volunteers that was becoming givers instead of just receivers. They wanted to be able to give or give back, and they saw this as growing up and no longer just being kids, only receiving. So receiving and giving is something to these people that meant being a grown-up. Yeah. Then there was a detachment. After the attachment, there was a detachment. This is an example of detachment. A volunteer who experiences that on the tube, how he's treated badly because he's wearing the uniform. So there's a process of detachment which I go through, and I don't have the time here. But they reflect on what it's like to serve in public. So, and he says how him trying to go out of his way to be there for other people in the public makes other people find him awkward. They find him suspicious. So yeah, that's interesting. So, and this concludes that it only works within those who know what the uniform means. And to the people outside, it doesn't make sense if they all of a sudden serve in a particular way. I always ended my interviews with asking, how do you feel about your uniform? Which led to a division between the social meaning and the individual and pragmatic meaning of the uniform to the volunteers. The social one was quite symbolic, and this was quite pragmatic. This was quite emotional, and this was quite practical. And it revealed in particular how everybody could relate to putting on the social skin. So it particularly revealed this community of everyday communism. Everybody can relate to how the uniform, that you're able to put something else on, and it's changeable, and recognizing that among each other was part of the recognizing each other as human beings, and an example of human community. So that's what I sketch here. It's a community with a uniform, community behind the uniform, and both of them was recognized. Yeah, I'm not going to say. Yeah. This is good. So the thesis contributes with understanding learning among volunteers in City of London. And it also shows the importance of the development of the innovation and entrepreneurial theoretical field, including social entrepreneurship, of in-depth anthropological research which gets close to processes by individuals and communities that can be observed as learning processes. And I'm using economic anthropology as an example. That's my contribution. Thank you.